Hello, everybody. My name is Lori Gunther. I am the CEO of Sonova Associates, and I'm pleased to bring this session to you. This session is entitled Using Data Analytics and Process Improvement to Predict Staffing Needs and Decrease the Need for Floating. I'm happy to introduce our two presenters, Joan Rikli. Joan is the president of the National Association of Neonatal Nurses and the nursing director for the Neonatal Intensive Care and Pediatric Services at Helen DeVos Children's Hospital in Grand Rapids. She received her MBA from Grand Valley State University and her MSN from the University of Michigan and her BSN from UCLA. Joan has over 35 years of experience in nursing leadership and neonatal nursing. She has multiple publications and speaks on various topics across the country. Welcome, Joan. Next, we have Gabe Laney. Gabe has 9 years of nursing experience, with 5 of those being in a leadership role. His experiences are in adult trauma, cardiac, and neurointensive care, as well as the neonatal intensive care unit. He is a nurse manager for a 108-bed NICU with 1,600 annual admissions, and also has direct oversight of the neonatal transport program that completes 270 transports per year. Welcome, Gabe. Joan, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Great. Thank you, Lori. Excited to be here today. So here are our objectives for our presentation. The first is to describe the use of data to predict future staffing needs in the NICU. And the second is to describe short and long-term strategies to meet staffing needs safely. We have nothing to disclose. So what exactly is the problem that we're trying to address? As Lori mentioned, we have a very large NICU, 108 beds, and we're part of a children's hospital that sees wide variation in census between winter and summer. That's probably true in many of your areas as well. When our budgets were built, they were built to provide full-time equivalents, which is the measure that we use for determining staffing. They build that around an average census. And so it never really meets our peaks or our valleys. It's an average number, and you can probably count on one hand the number of times in a year that we've got an average census. So we deal with these peaks and valleys by floating nurses from one unit to another to meet census demands. In our pediatric ICU, it's usually quite short-staffed in the wintertime. When we have RSV season, the children's hospital fills up with kids with viruses. And overflow spaces are sometimes also having to be opened to accommodate the higher pediatric census during this winter season. The NICU is typically busier in the summer. Why that is a bit of a mystery, although my theory is that it's due to dehydration or being busy with kids at home in the summertime. At any rate, our census is usually higher in the summer in the NICU. And so what we do in addition to floating nurses is we require extra shifts for everyone to work to increase the number of staff available for coverage in the winter period. So what's the impact of these kinds of staffing plans to meet our peaks and valleys? Obviously, staff dissatisfaction is the biggest one, and we hear it every year loud and clear. Staff are dissatisfied because they're unfamiliar with the routines on other units. They are their FTE, or their regular worked hours, for a reason. They're part-time because they want to work part-time, or they're full-time because they want to work full-time, and they're not too excited about having to work extra. They can't count on much extra help from other people on an unfamiliar unit when they're floated there, because usually they're floated because everyone is very busy and short. There are different cultures on our different units, and there really is a desire for people who are NICU nurses to work in the NICU. There are some safety issues as well. In our pediatric floors and our pediatric ICUs, some of the equipment is unfamiliar. Some of the diagnoses are different than what we see in the NICU, and medications are certainly different. And our NICU nurses are not PALS certified. They are NRP certified. And so if there were an emergency, they are worried that they might not have the skills needed to deal with that emergency. Plus, this kind of staffing plan is very expensive. We use a lot of overtime. We turn on incentive programs where extra shifts are incented at a higher rate of pay. And we even sign people up with a contract for doing a certain number of shifts over a period of time and then getting a lump sum at the end. We sometimes use travelers. We sometimes use gift cards for those spur of the moment additional shifts where we need somebody for 4 hours, and we'll give them a Meijer gift card for 25 bucks for 4 hours of work, and that's always very popular. We've heard comments on our staff satisfaction and our patient safety surveys with dissatisfaction and concerns about the way that we staff our children's hospital and our NICU. And we've had complaints to Human Resources and even to the Joint Commission. So this past year, we decided that we were going to try and be a little bit more proactive and come up with a different approach. This was really stemmed from our Shared Leadership Council, which is made up of mostly staff. And we pulled in our process improvement team for some assistance to look at this in a different way with a different lens. We formed a work group that was made up of staff nurses, nurse managers, directors, and our vice president for nursing. And it was facilitated by our process improvement team. And really our goal of this plan was to provide the right nurse to the right patient at the right time and to be able to respond nimbly to changes in census. These were the metrics that we decided to follow: staff satisfaction, family satisfaction, overtime hours, and then the average number of hours in terms of full-time equivalents that were worked outside of one's home unit. And you can see what our current values were for each of those. We were averaging 26.3 FTEs of RN working outside of their home unit to cover during our last winter season. And we had a goal to try and decrease that rate by about 30%. Our staff and family satisfaction, we hope we would not make any worse, and our desire was to make it a little bit better. And we were hoping to do this with less overtime. So some short-term experiments that we implemented, I'm going to briefly outline here, and certainly if there are questions later, we can go into it in more detail. We provided more training for staff about meds and equipment that they might encounter on other floors, and had a learning cart that went from space to space so people could practice. We implemented buddy sheets outlining what the routines were, what contact numbers could people reach out to, and where to go for help if they're on an unfamiliar unit. We increased our float pool, and this was probably the most significant change we made in the short term. We provided a one-time option for transfers from the units into our float pool while the nurse was able to keep their same shift and their FTE status. In the past, it was only allowed to go to the float pool on the night shift, and then by seniority, people moved to days. But this provided a one-time moratorium where people could keep their day shift if they were already on days and move into the float pool. 16 individuals moved from the units to the float pool when we made this change. We started hiring new graduates to our float pool to help staff our ICUs. And we hired some positions that had a flexible FTE, so that during the quiet time of the year, they worked a 0.6, but they flexed up to a 0.9 in the busy season. And we redesigned our nurse tech roles so that we could move our nurse techs from one unit to another more easily. In addition, we had different door codes and locks on our carts throughout the children's hospital, which made it difficult if you were on an unfamiliar unit to navigate and do your daily work. So we standardized those throughout the building. We built in an incentive in the NICU for individuals who are willing to go out of turn and be the first to float, so they'd get paid a little extra. We piloted a discharge nurse role on our pediatric floors to be able to increase throughput and thus have more bed spaces available and not have to overflow to unfamiliar spaces. We added a floor identifier to our name badges. With people floating everywhere, it was sometimes not easy to tell who was a new nurse on your unit or who perhaps was being floated from another unit. So we now have a number that's under our name on our badge so that people know that we might be unfamiliar to that unit and could use a little help. And then finally, we developed a really robust system of data analytics to help us predict future fluctuations in census and to really be more proactive in meeting anticipated needs. And Gabe is going to go through that for you in more detail.
Yeah, thanks, Joan. So predictive analytics can be used to help us determine how to get appropriate staffing levels at the appropriate time. Using time series modeling to see historical trends in admission and average census data, we can use these trends to help us be prepared for what we can expect to see at certain intervals throughout the year. Just like any business, healthcare has supply and demand, and as leaders, we need to be reactive to meet this demand as cost effectively as possible. The chart to the right shows that we still find ways to meet this demand, but there is a significant cost to it. Instead of meeting the demand with premium pay and incentives, our goal in the future is to meet it with regular pay staff. Next slide. This chart shows 31 months worth of daily census data and includes the mean for this time frame. The first thing that stands out here to us is the variability. We see a census as low as 68 and a census as high as 115. There's peaks and there's valleys, but overall, this raw data is a little difficult to make useful. Looking at census by plotting out individual days within a large time frame was a little too granular for us. The one thing, however, that we can note is the clear upward trend of our average census during this 31-month time frame. We'll get into that upward trajectory a little bit later, but we'll move on to show you how we aggregate this data to be useful. This is the same 31-month time frame, but this is showing average census by month instead of the daily data like the previous chart. This is a lot easier on the eyes to look at, and you can see that the colors correlate with the years. Blue is 2018, green is 2019, and red is 2020. It starts to become easier to see that these peaks and valleys are actually occurring month by month, so it helped us identify trends. You can see that summer months appear to be higher than fall and winter months. And you can also see that trend line we put in there again that shows our overall trajectory of average census is increasing. Next slide. This is the same average census by month data that we made even cleaner by layering the years on top of each other, and the same colors correlate to the same years as the previous chart. This made it even easier still for us to identify trends, and we found we have trends by season. Based on the way the data is grouped, we determined that we really have 3 seasons that vary from each other: fall, winter, and summer. Our data for spring was too close to winter data to consider it significant, so we wrote these months into our winter season for this purpose. I know I'm sounding like a broken record here, but I want to point out again that the growth by year really stands out when we look at our numbers with this layered format, with the exception of May, June, and July of 2020. We're thinking this stray from the trend could potentially be related to COVID-19, as I know there's been some observations of decreased NICU admissions worldwide due to the pandemic. We don't have those answers, but maybe someone else has those in a different presentation. Next slide. This slide is showing all 31 months of data with those averages by month, and it highlights the 3 seasons that we identified. There's a seasonal mean line in here as well, which is 88. Historically, we use our yearly average census to determine how many nurses to hire and how many nurses to have on shift. With such a large unit and such large census swings, you can see how this is really trying to shoot a moving target. Next slide. Here, we present our 3 seasons and use all 31 months worth of data to give us average census ranges for these seasons. It's very clear with this chart that we have significant census swings per season. The colors here correlate to their respective seasons like in the previous slide. Looking at all of this data and finding these seasonal trends was very eye-opening for us, but what to do with this information is where we struggled. I promise I'm only going to bore you once with math in this next slide, but I think it's important to explain how we use these numbers to help us staff our unit. Using our defined HPPD that was already in place for our unit, we can use a simple equation to determine how many FTEs we need to staff a given census. For those of you who don't use HPPD or use a different financial indicator, HPPD is hours per patient day. And just as it sounds, this is how many hours of direct care it takes to provide care for one patient in a given day. We calculate HPPD by multiplying the amount of direct caregivers on for a given shift by 24, which is how many hours are in a day, and dividing that by our total census. To determine FTEs needed to meet a certain census, we multiply our HPPD by the census, which gives us our total hours. We multiply our total hours by our RN skill mix to give us RN hours needed per day. We then divide those total hours by 40, which is how many hours in a week, and multiply that by 7, which is how many days in a week, which gives us your FTE total needed for a given census. Figure 7 shows our FTE need by season. There's also data in there for our nurse techs that we need. Next slide. In order to make this useful, we needed a strong position control tool that gave us our FTE data and compared it to what our need is for each season. We use this data to create a hiring target when we're posting positions. We know we're slowest in the fall, busier in the winter, and busiest in the summer. So we know we need to start hiring for our summer need in the fall so that these nurses are prepared and onboarded so they can be counted in actual worked hours for the summer. This screenshot from our position control tools shows our actual worked FTEs at the moment, and I've circled the FTE variance for what our summer need is. The columns are just showing 4-hour staffing blocks and our 6-week course schedule rotation. Next slide. This chart is showing our total FTEs, which includes those that are on orientation. Notice the difference in our summer need variance and how improved that is. While we are slightly overhired for winter, those orientation FTEs will not be fully onboarded and in our actual worked FTE count until just before spring. Next slide. Our position control tool also pulls in our weekend variances and breaks those out by season as well. Our team can use this when onboarding new staff to determine which weekend rotation to place them on. This heat map is showing admissions by month as opposed to average census like the previous data. Blue indicates lower volumes, while red indicates higher volumes. Unlike the data used for our position control, this has about 10 years worth of data going back to 2009. As you can see in this table, we are experiencing year after year growth. The turning point between 2011 and 2013 is due to the opening of our brand new children's tower during that time period. This time series has the same admission data as the heat map, but when it's plotted out like this, you can see our upward trajectory over the last 10 years. There's a lot of variability in admissions between 2009 and 2013, but as the children's hospital is up and running, our variability becomes less severe and we see more consistent upward growth. This chart takes the rate of growth we have had over the last 10 years and forecasts that same growth rate out to 2024. This is showing total annual admissions instead of admissions by month, but if this were to hold true, we would certainly exceed our capacity by a significant amount, so this is important that we can use this to plan for future expansion. So in doing all this, we learned quite a few things and we're still learning. One thing that we've learned is that NICU summer census is a significant driver of PICU winter census. It seems kind of like a no-brainer, but when we really looked at the data, that definitely held true for us. Our kiddos that discharge from the summer tend to be more complicated kiddos, and as they go home, they tend to come back with respiratory concerns in the winter. We also obviously learned we need to proactively hire to meet demands for summer season, which is our busier season. So as I mentioned earlier, we're preparing for that summer season in the fall when we're hiring and onboarding new nurses. We've also sustained growth over the last decade that I made apparent throughout the presentation. So this is really important for us to consider as we reach our capacity limits. And if we're going to consider future expansion, I think this data can help drive what we would expand to. We also know it's not a perfect solution. It's not a crystal ball. And we need to consider creative solutions as well if we're overhired or underhired for certain seasons. Some things we've thrown out there are flex type staffing, where staff can have a certain FTE that flexes up or flexes down based on what our census is. School nurse type hours, where you have a nurse that works a certain time during the year, or creative solutions within our resource center.
So here are our results. Am I still muted? No. Our staff satisfaction and family satisfaction scores really did not change between the pre and post measurement time. However, our overall overtime did decrease fairly significantly, although it did not meet our goal. And our average RNs working outside of the unit also dropped from 26.3 FTEs before we started this program to 18 afterward, and that's for the entire children's hospital. For the NICU specifically, before we started this program, we were averaging 6.7 hours or FTEs outside of the unit, and after down to a 0.1. This data has to be taken with a grain of salt because we indeed had differences in our normal seasons because of COVID-19. So we need to look at this more in the future to see if we really had the impact that is desired. That concludes our presentation, but we are open to any questions you may have, and here's our contact information below. Thank you so much for giving us the time to talk to you today.
Great. Thank you so much, Joan, and thank you, Gabe. This was so interesting. I was really interested in, even anecdotally, do you feel like it improved sort of staff satisfaction and engagement? I know you said it didn't really change much, but did you receive like comments about at least the initiative?
Yeah, we certainly did. You know, Joan kind of mentioned staff satisfaction, and polling between the units is definitely a big staff dissatisfier. So one thing we did when we really worked on this was have a lot of staff nurses involved in our staffing innovations group. So I think having staff involved and having them kind of be champions of this so they can go back to the unit and communicate with their peers the work that we're doing, that there is global attention on it, definitely helped with staff satisfaction. Previously, I think their perception was that we weren't doing anything and that we weren't aware that there was a concern. So even though it may not have felt different immediately, I think for them to know that there is a lot of attention at high levels looking at it was definitely a positive impact.
Yeah, I agree.
Okay, great. Well, boy, Joan, I'm really excited from the time when we talked about this session all the way back. It was a year ago, so it's nice to see the outcomes. Thank you so much for sharing this really important information. This is one of the hottest topics that we have questions about, and I love the innovative approach to this. So thank you very much for your time, and we hope everybody enjoys this presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you.